Hi, everyone, and welcome to this podcast on emergencies and the EU Economic and Monetary Union. This episode is part of EmergEU, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on Crises and Emergencies in European Integration, managed by Professor Andrea Ott at the Faculty of Law. The center is embedded in CEREM, the Interdisciplinary Center of European Research in Maastricht, which brings together scholars from the Faculty of Law and the Faculty of Social Sciences at Maastricht University. In this episode, we explore how crises and emergencies have shaped the evolution of the EU Economic and Monetary Union since its creation in 1992. Before we begin, a brief clarification. Throughout this episode, we use Economic and Monetary Union in a broad sense, and that includes the rules in the EU treaties that allocate competences to EU institutions in the field of economic governance, as well as the rules that bind member states to comply with certain principles. The Economic and Monetary Union is based on two interconnected pillars. First, the powers of the European Central Bank to conduct monetary policy for the EU's single currency, the euro. And second, the powers of the Council of the EU, supported by the Commission, to coordinate member states' economic and fiscal policies, and increasingly, to shape a dimension of EU economic policy, particularly in response to crises of the last decade. We'll unpack these dynamics in more detail with our two speakers today, who have extensively researched the Economic and Monetary Union. I am joined by Anna Bobić and Marijn van der Sluis. Anna is a senior research fellow at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and Marijn is an assistant professor in EU law at Maastricht University. They will present later today, this afternoon, two papers at the law faculty during a workshop organized for EmergEU. As for myself, I'm Alessandro Cuomo, and I'm a Ph.D. researcher in EU law at Maastricht University, and I have the pleasure to host this episode and ask Anna and Marijn a few questions. So without further ado, maybe let's turn to our first question as a kickoff of our conversation. So what comes to mind when you hear the words crises and emergencies in connection to the European Economic and Monetary Union?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take off. Thanks a lot for having me. I thought about this, and I think three things come to mind. And the first one is really this: whatever it takes by Mario Draghi. I always found it fascinating that it's become like this, almost like a pop culture statement at this point. You know, I remember seeing this graffiti in Italy, like, "You are as beautiful as Mario Draghi's whatever it takes." So it's really, I think, shaped how we saw the crisis. But what I always found more interesting was the second part of that sentence, where he says, "And trust me, it will be enough," which is really like almost a threat. And I think that it really materialized. The second thing I think that comes really strongly in this crisis is, of course, the division between, this narrative between debtor and creditor countries that were pitted against each other. And that has helped us completely lose focus from the financial sector, which was arguably at the core, at the cause of the crisis. So we don't really ask the question, or we do, but not really in EU legal research, who was giving what sort of loans to whom before the crisis and before the bubble burst. And I think this is, not to deny that some budgets were managed poorly and less poorly than others. But it does shed light on some of the causes that I think were then not at the center of the answers and responses to the crisis. And the last thing I would say is really a total improvisation, improvise, a disregard of the rules. The rules, first of all, constrained us to properly respond to the crisis, particularly the ECB. And then we just said, all right, let's just go outside the EU legal framework and do what we can.
Thank you.
Thanks, first of all, also for having me on the podcast. Happy to speak with such very knowledgeable people on this topic. What comes to mind with crisis? For me, it's two things. The first is, of course, the economic sacrifice and hurt that came, and you already referred to it, especially in the debtor countries, that it brought really significant problems, and with that, a real doubt about the future of European integration. If all the Euroscepticism, I think, from the last couple of years, it really started with that Euro crisis, both in the North and the South, but also as a result of the economic problems that arose for many people directly as a result of the Euro crisis. And the second thing is almost the unavoidability of it. I think the lack of sense of what will we do if a crisis comes? How are we going to deal with this? The idea of a monetary union that you settle once and for all in the Maastricht Treaty, and then we have the proper rules, and then we're going to be fine. I think that sense, that feeling, almost makes it unavoidable that you're going to have a crisis, because monetary and financial affairs, they're never stable possessions. And the more you think you've got it settled, I think the more there will be ways in which the dynamics create new problems. And if you don't have the tools to deal with that, then you're gonna end up with a big crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, true. I was reflecting that it's true that the Euro crisis has shaped entirely also somehow the history and the imagination now of Europeans, for the good or for the bad. Maybe moving to the second question. So if we go back to the Maastricht Treaty, which was signed specifically in this city when we're recording, when the initial constitutional architecture of the Economic and Monetary Union was agreed by member states. So what transformations did the 1992 settlement bring to European integration, to the process of European integration? And now, with the benefit of knowing what happened later, did that architecture, whether too ambitious or just maybe too naive, proved least capable of withstanding unforeseen crises?
All right, I'll take this one first. So what I think the Maastricht Treaty did is it locked in economic dependency. It said we are going to continue together on this path of monetary integration. Whereas previous arrangements of monetary affairs, they always had a sense of flexibility. They always had an out, and the out, the leaving the system, always gave the opportunity for financial forces to push a state out, as we've seen with the UK, with the pound earlier. And so what the Maastricht Treaty did, I think it was a promise to say we're going to continue together, and whatever happens, that lock in. We're going to do this from now on. If you're in, and there's no escaping it. And the second part of the question is, so what part of the Maastricht architecture survived or not, or which is most naive or not? I think that's a very difficult question. If you look at architecture purely as the set of rules of the Maastricht Treaty, I think it's very easy for all of them to say, there's an economic view in there that maybe didn't survive. But I would say from a political constitutional perspective, the Maastricht Treaty actually did rather well, because it said, here's a division of competences for certain institutions, but we as member states are going to retain control over the process of European integration. Who's in charge here? Who's going to have a say on where, if there is a crisis, they didn't really think there was going to be, but if there is something going to happen, who is the boss of the euro? That's the member states. That is not the European Parliament. That's not the Commission. We're not giving an open-ended idea, a competence to conduct monetary and economic affairs. By limiting it, by writing it down in the treaty, it was also a sense, if this doesn't work, you're going to have to come back to us, the member states, and we collectively are going to decide what to do next. And I think that element has survived surprisingly well throughout the crisis. They were in charge during the Euro crisis. And I think it is a result of the setup of the Maastricht Treaty. So it depends a bit on how you see that architecture.
Yeah, I think I have a completely different view. So I think I would start perhaps with what was naive about the setup. And that, I think, is a set of economic assumptions behind the way that the EMU was formed, but primarily the fact that monetary policy was kind of elevated to this exclusive competence pedestal. And this is what the literature calls the so-called Frankfurt-Brussels consensus, right? So there's a literature out there telling us that actually the people who formed the EMU based on these assumptions were simply proven wrong. So some of the assumptions here are, for example, that shocks are no longer to be redressed by central banks, for example, but by flexible labor markets, right? So that the member states can continue freely intervening into labor markets, which is not true once you no longer have control over the currency. The second assumption was, for example, that the Stability and Growth Pact will in itself ensure budgetary responsibility, which we also saw already in 2004 with France and Germany. It was really not the case. And that resulting from that, budgetary policy as a system-wide thing is really not necessary because price stability will do its own thing. And this is really one of the crucial, I think, mistakes of the Maastricht system because, of course, the budget is the guarantee of the value of the currency. And we've created a money without a state. And we've also lost the central bank as the lender of last resort for the sovereign. The ECB has now remained only the lender of last resorts for the financial sector. And the last thing is that the central bank shouldn't be caring about financial stability because, markets are rational and efficient, and so long as there's price stability, things will work out fine. But as we've seen in the crisis, this is really not the case, right? The liquidity and the insolvency crisis have been caused by one another. So these are some of these kind of assumptions and views of the market, I guess, as such, that proved really naive. The second thing that I find extremely interesting about the constitutional architecture of the EMU is this role of epistemic communities in its creation. So there's really, again, super interesting research out there by Kathleen McNamara, first of all, in The Currency of Ideas, really describing how certain ideas became dominant in the creation of the EMU. This, of course, concerns primarily central bank independence as such. Why do we need central bank independence? What does it give us? And really the role of central bankers in this process. She calls this institutional isomorphism, in that we see central bank independence elsewhere. It's considered successful and credible, so we should do it as well, right? I think those would be my reflections.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I was reflecting, Marijn, exactly on the idea of irreversibility. So the fact that you mentioned that the euro was agreed and in a way was assumed that it would be fixed, irreversible, and without somehow of an exit option. Member states can leave the EU, but there's no explicit option to leave the euro as such. So how that design feature then influenced what happened later. And Anna, yes, about the ideas, I think it's very interesting to then reflect how much then a constitutional text should, absorb or reflect, codify ideas that then change over the decades. I think the history of humanity is a constant change of ideas. Well, then how these ideas changed or how these assumptions were proven wrong, I think we had a view over the euro crisis. So moving to the next question. So 2 decades after the Maastricht Treaty, stability in the economic and monetary union, which was a big idea behind the whole framework, was shattered by the euro crisis, or stability as was envisioned. What was the biggest impact of the euro crisis on the original, let's call it, orthodox understanding of the rules of the economic and monetary union?
Yeah, sure. I think several things. So the first thing, I think, is our undying belief in the lack of necessity for risk sharing. I think that the original idea was really, so long as we have budgetary responsibility, things will simply work out. Although we share a currency, there is absolutely no need for the member states within the Eurozone to also share risks, right? So this is exemplified in the treaty with the no bailout clause and the prohibition of monetary financing. But we have seen that this simply cannot work. Even at the beginning, we have seen the crisis as the Greek crisis. And only gradually have we come to realize that this is a systemic crisis and that we cannot isolate Greece, pump in conditionality-backed loans, and just, expect everything to go fine for the rest of the Eurozone. So I think that although this idea is still in the treaties, I think one great problem is precisely how locked in we are, right? So we now need all the member states to take us out of this text, which is highly unlikely. But I think we have come to realize certainly that the complete exclusion of risk sharing, and again, despite proclamations of the German Constitutional Court that this is an eternal feature of the EMU, we simply can't have it both ways, I think. I think that's one big lesson. The second one is really how we've approached crises. So the Euro crisis resulted in the ECB pursuing deflationary policies, which is awful for economic growth and prosperity. It causes a complete shrinking of the economy, and austerity. And so these are both really terrible for economic recovery. I was teaching this last semester to my students, and I found a graph, we were analyzing it. It compares the different global crises throughout the last century and a half. So, for example, the Great Depression in the US, the Argentinian crisis, and the Greek, and all of these crises around the fifth year. Once we have massive public spending, all of them start to evaporate and the countries start getting better. But the Greeks are the only one who are still not even back at their starting point. So it is really terrible to think that austerity is the way to go. And I think that the EmergEU goes to show that we have now figured out that we should actually invest. And last point is that I think what we've now learned is that we can no longer pretend that monetary policy is neutral as regards redistribution. That about this, equally as with risk sharing, we need to be explicit, and because it's so visible.
I fully agree with the different readings of our economic insights, right? That what we've learned collectively, that we need to have the old ideas, the old economic ideas of EMU don't work. They had false ideas baked in. But what I find so interesting about that is that most of that they've been able to do that without fundamentally changing the treaties. And I think what also the crisis showed is that the treaties maybe were not as orthodox as many read it to start with. So all the ideas that were supposed to be in EMU, maybe if you look at the treaties, they're not as clear as we thought them originally to be in there. Now, for example, if you write a no bailout clause, if you really take the idea of a no bailout clause, the strictest of strictest ideas of the orthodox vision, we are not allowed to help you, therefore you will have better fiscal policy. But if you look at the text, it says you shall not be liable for. Well, I think if you ask any lawyer to draft a proper no bailout clause, they wouldn't come up with the no bailout clause as it's currently in the text. It's clearly meant to be weaker than the orthodox vision of it. And I think the same goes for the excessive deficit procedure. It does not prohibit deficits. It says you shall avoid them, which is a very peculiar phrasing. I don't think it even should be called enforcement, but with the council keeping an eye on it. So member states looking at each other, knowing that they're quite soft on each other generally. And also with the European Central Bank, the idea that you can just have price stability in there and then no other thoughts about what that would mean and how you define price stability and who you leave it up to. So you just give this big power to the European Central Bank and you say, we hope you're going to do this with it. I don't think, if you truly take the idea of price stability serious, you might have to wonder about the price stability of what? Of the Eurozone, of the euro in the Eurozone. Okay, so if you take price stability serious, you need to take the considerations for the entire Eurozone membership into consideration. So I think also what the crisis showed to me is that maybe the Maastricht Treaty was a bit more open than the orthodox views has always made it out to be. So maybe we can also look at a little bit back and say, well, maybe we should not have gone with the full economic interpretation of what the Maastricht Treaty, what they were telling us from the beginning, and just look at the text and say, is this really a no bailout clause? No, I don't think so. Is there a 3% rule? No, there isn't. Is the ECB really purely strictly limited to doing this? No, because it is part of a treaty that has a whole range of other types of obligations and instructions. Now we're having that debate over green monetary policy. If you make a central bank part of the treaties, then you're going to have a broader effect. So I think what's also shocking to me is that there is not enough reflection in my eyes on what we can demand of law. Can you really inscribe these ideas in law? And what are they then supposed to be doing? So that, I think, is for me the big question. But I fully agree that the underlying economic ideas have shifted and they have revealed what is partially necessary and partially still needs to be done. But for me, one of the interesting lessons is what the role of law has been in this.
Yeah.
Can I follow up?
Of course.
I really like these reflections because it also, I think, invites us to think in whose eyes has the treaty been rigid or flexible, and at what point in time, right? So the actors during the crisis were still acting with these orthodox views of the treaties. And then now later on, we are able to kind of patch up perhaps what has happened in the past by saying, well, perhaps the treaties were more flexible than we originally thought now with hindsight. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe, Marijn, to pick on a point that you made, I think it's perfectly true that once you delve through this sometimes very big scholarship on the interpretation of certain rules, and you just put your eyes on the rules themselves, you find that they are indeed more, or at least less orthodox and less strict than they had been interpreted for a long time. Which doesn't mean for a long time they haven't been interpreted strictly. They have, especially during the crisis, and that's why some of the policy outcomes were the ones that Anna described. But then when moving to shifting interpretations, and Anna, you mentioned already the Next Generation EU, then if we move then a decade after the Euro crisis, or first test of acting in an unforeseen situation, is today the Economic and Monetary Union different, and is it more crisis-proof? And faced with recent emergencies, new emergencies after the Euro crisis, from COVID-19 to the Russian-Ukrainian war, what have EU institutions and member states learned, in your opinion, or not, from the Euro crisis, and what new transformations are we witnessing today?
I think that one of the big ones, of course, and that's a lot of elements of European integration, is the role of the euro in geopolitical affairs. So what can the euro contribute? How should we look at the euro from a geopolitical perspective? And I think for some countries that has already for a long time been the standard part of why they, for example, wanted to join the euro. For many Baltic states, they really saw the euro as a choice for being a stronger member of the European Union. So for them, it already was a more strong geopolitical tool. But I think now it has become more obvious that the functioning of the euro is going to help determine also the role of the European Union in global affairs. And I think that's also what has made the euro quite strong at the moment, because if there is a crisis, I think there's going to be more willingness to use, to shore up the euro, to resolve the crisis, to not let it linger on as long, because there is a realization that a strong European Union is necessary in a more fragmented global order. So I would say that from a crisis perspective, the euro is looking quite good. That this is the political willingness is there to deal with any issues that may arise. So I think that is also, if we look at how the Euro crisis evolved, it was in the beginning a large part of involvement of the Americans. Now I think nowadays that would be unspeakable to invite the Americans to solve any type of Euro crisis. I think there is much more a sense of we need to fix this ourselves, and it is important in order to protect the standing of the European Union in the global order. Of course, that comes with its own caveats. That in several Eurozone countries there is an extreme far right growing, where it is unpredictable how they would react in an upcoming crisis. So I would say I'm a bit more positive now for the future of the euro than I was a couple of years ago, because of a changing political environment with distinct risks, I would see.
Yeah, I think the first thing is certainly, again, to go back a little bit to the NGU, but also to the SPP and the PEPP programs of the central bank, which caused so much controversy. But I think both these separate things show us that we have kind of a little bit shifted our mindset towards spending, that we have seen that this deep belief in austerity, that is, I think, still the strong legacy of Margaret Thatcher and our kind of dominant ways of thinking, is being left behind very slowly, but it is being left behind. So the idea is really that spending is good and this is what we need. I think it also shows us that it's inevitable that some economic and fiscal policy has to be centralized beyond what is in the orthodox text. So I guess we are also getting to a point where we see this text as way more flexible, that allows us some fiscal policy or economic policy more generally. I think another sort of result of the crisis is, or what we've perhaps learned about it, is that the ECB has really changed. It is now communicating regularly with the public. That's highly unusual for a central bank to all of a sudden have as its main audience not the bankers, not the banking system and the financial systems, but the public. I don't want to imply that this is the cause of the German constitutional courts barking at it to do so. I don't think so. But I do think that the ECB has not changed its behavior. It still kind of claims it's acting within its narrow Maastricht mandate, but it has really significantly changed its outward-facing character. And I think that's really unusual for a central bank. But what I think we haven't learned, and we still need to learn, is this paradox of the narrow mandate of an independent central bank. Because a narrow mandate really is supposed to ensure its credibility, but its credibility is lost once it has to deal with crisis for which it is not equipped. So I think this is one transformation that we're still waiting to happen.
I fully agree. And I think one interesting element in that, you also already mentioned EmergEU and the responses of the ECB during the COVID crisis. But I think one interesting element in that was that during COVID, it was the first time that the ECB acted before the political sphere acted. In the Euro crisis, all the major steps from the European Central Bank always came after big political decisions. The same with the "it will be enough" speech that came after the decision on banking union. And I think the interesting thing here was that it acted before the political sphere, but there was very little controversy that it took those decisions. So I think you're very right in identifying that the shift is around that. Do we allow the central bank to take the appropriate course without constantly questioning every single choice that it makes in dealing with crises? Yeah, so I think that's correct. In I fully support that idea that's where one of the key shifts lie. Yeah.
Yeah. Then maybe immediately taken from this to the next question: what about possible reforms, or where should we go from here? So we started from an orthodoxly interpreted framework. We moved through at least a couple of crises, and where should we go from here? So can you think of two ideas, two reforms that in your view would render the economic and monetary union architecture more sustainable and crisis ready going forward?
Yeah. If I had a magic wand and a pen to add some track changes to the treaties, the first thing that I would do is to change the ECB's mandate. So throughout the history of central banking, we know that central banks have also successfully done other things. So, and even today they do so. So, for example, the Bank of England has a dual mandate. One is price stability, but the other is employment. And I don't see anything wrong with that. So I think that first of all, reflecting on the scope of the ECB's mandate would also help us reflect on the sort of consequences that price stability has or monetary dominance has. And it would also kind of make us reflect more explicitly what are our common shared goals. You want to intervene super quickly? Please do. No,
can I
please.
ask a follow-up question on that? Would you then also want to change its independence or just its
I'm so glad you asked. Yes. I mean, perhaps I can speak of that in our last question, because that's kind of what my paper is about. I have, dedicated a lot of thinking to the independence question itself. So I'm happy to speak of it a bit more perhaps in a minute. But certainly I think an independent central bank that only focuses on price stability is a very specific EU thing. It is not, the way that central banks around the world work. So I do think we can change this mindset. I think that this is kind of this myth that we've built around the ECB that I don't think is completely unchangeable. And the second thing I would change, although as you rightly pointed out, Marijn, in the text, the prohibition of risk sharing in the treaties is perhaps not as stringent as we think, but I do think we need to be explicit about the fact that we are inevitably forced to share risks. So I don't know if I would enter a clause in the treaty saying we share risks, but I would certainly try to find a way to change the no bailout clause in a way that simply acknowledges that we're in this boat together, right? We hang together, or what is the expression? So those would be perhaps my two main changes. And of course, I mean, this includes somehow changing the economic and fiscal policy competence of the EU. Without this, of course, there's no point in acknowledging risk sharing. Yeah.
I'm really look forward to your presentation now. So that's good. Two things. Well, one would be coming back to the point you brought in the beginning, Anna, and that was that the Euro crisis kind of pushed our view away from the financial sector. And I think one of the interesting things we could do is resist the deregulatory agenda now for banks. That's also going to come. We've seen a large deregulatory agenda from the Commission in any case. But I think one thing we could do is make sure that the capital requirements stay the same or go up a bit, and it would increase requirements for shadow banking, where we say, well, if we saw one of the causes of the crisis was unstable financial sector, and I think that's where we could intervene without too much a treaty change in any case. So that I think would be a more political decision, something that could be done that would strengthen the Eurozone as a whole. And the second one is also building on another point of yours, the spending we need to spend. But then I would say, well, what are we going to spend on? I think we always need an objective. We need a reason for what we're going to spend on. And there I would say, let's make that the green industrial policy. We're trying to do a green transformation, a climate transformation that is regulated on the European level, but mostly used tool is new rules, new regulations in place. And if we're going to spend money somewhere, let's do it in that area where we say, let's have a proper European industrial policy where we say, okay, and there you can also combine it with the geopolitical sense of what are our strengths and weaknesses that we can solve with a proper European green industrial policy. And I think that you can solve multiple problems at once. So a green industrial policy, if to shore up again now with energy prices rising, I think there's also a good good reason to do it now and to push for a new initiative where we say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And I don't think the next generation EU RRF model is going to be I don't think that's the way to go. And I'm happy that there's a lot of pushback against the Commission's proposal for the new MFF, but a proper European industrial policy, I think, would be a way to go.
Thank you. And then to conclude, to move towards the last question, one about your papers that you both mentioned. You're going to present 2 papers this afternoon during a workshop for EmergEU. So would you like briefly to explain to us what topics you picked, what was the reasoning behind it, and few insights or findings that you would like to share with us before the presentation?
Okay. So one thing that I've always found very difficult when I look at the euro and all the legal literature and also the political debates is the role of the excessive deficit procedure. So Article 126. And if you look at it from a bit of a lefty perspective, then the argument is always this constrains what the member states can do. This really blocks them from doing whatever they want to do. This limits them, which is difficult because there's never been a fine. In 20 years, no one has received a fine for excessive spending. So can it really be that blocking if no one has ever been fined? And on the other hand, there is the idea, and that's a bit more from the right-wing and conservative side, that there's this idea that there is this rule and it is never enforced. And it just doesn't work. And I just always found it fascinating how you can have these two discourses at the same time. And I think they're both they take a view on what these rules are that I think is not in the treaty. So it has so what I do in the paper is I want to examine purely from a legal perspective, what is in these rules and how should we look at them? And I think one of the conclusions is that you cannot say that there is a 3% rule. It's just not, I can't legally wrap my hand. That's not from a realistic, you're never going to get a fine. But I don't think as a member state, there is a legal obligation to keep your deficit within 3%. Even if we take into account all the exceptions, I think you shouldn't see them as exceptions. I think there's a whole range of factors to be taken into account in determining for the council what is an excessive deficit. But all elements of Article 126 point into a different direction, that it's not a single rule where there is enforcement, but it has another purpose. So that's what I want to do in the paper is what is that purpose and how can we describe it? How can we make sense of all the legal detail from the court case from 2004 to the revisions of the Stability and Growth Pact. So I want to tell a new story for Article 126 that shies away from both these perspective on what the rules are or supposed to do and to give a more coherent narrative of what was it supposed to do and has it succeeded in actually fulfilling that role. So that's what I want to. I want to solve that puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
Nice, can't wait to hear it. My paper, as already kind of alluded to, is about central bank independence. So I've spent quite a few years obsessing over central bank accountability. And Marijn recently published a paper, and not just me, of course, a huge amount of ULO scholarship devoted unbelievable amounts of energy to solving this eternal puzzle of accountability dancing around independence, right? And it was always, where do we find this balance? And Marijn told us we were all wrong. We should have been thinking about legitimacy. And although maybe I don't agree with that point, I do think there's some accountability fatigue. I mean, it's clearly not bringing us forward anymore, or we have simply said what there is to be said. So I started thinking, okay, what about independence? What problem did central bank independence try to solve? When did it come about in history? And why has then it been so cemented in the ECB's design? And then subsequently, what problems then this kind of independence caused in turn? And it's really highly interesting to read that actually the central bank independence kind of dogma is a thing of the 90s. We seem to think that this is simply how we've done things always, but it's really completely new. It's a thing that emerged from after the oil crisis, the inflation crisis of the 70s. We've been wrapping around our head in the 80s what to do, how to still ensure international trade and stable prices. So then in the 90s is really when we see the largest rise in the number of central banks. And I think that what research about central bank independence has shown us is kind of two things. One is that, of course, it insulates technocrats from political pressure. That is what the right, the more right interpretation would call, removing the central bank from election cycle pressures. But on the other hand, what research shows is also that it protects political decision makers from making difficult choices, right? And taking responsibility for painful economic outcomes. And what I'm kind of trying to suggest is that this is not the only way to do central banking by far. So among these kind of three big macroeconomic elements, which is price stability, growth, and employment, stable employment, we have simply picked price stability, but that is really not the only way to go. And so there is a political choice inherent in making price stability the job of the ECB and the main aim. So I'm trying to see other ways of doing it while not sounding like Trump and attacking central bank independence.
I always find it very dangerous, very difficult when writing about these topics. Is you are in a political camp so easily, and I fully agree with your perspective on independence that it shouldn't be this holy grail of monetary policy design. But you're so quickly into, so you're okay with that. Absolutely. So I'm very fascinating. Yeah.
Great. And I'm very looking forward to our workshop this afternoon. I think both your ideas, interestingly, from different perspectives, but they, if I understood correctly, they try to present more like new narratives and new refreshing ways of looking at the same maybe law that we had since Maastricht, but showing that there is maybe more, there are new ways of maybe telling the same story. So from my side, thank you very much again. And maybe it's the moment to wrap this up. As I said, we're going to discuss these papers more in detail this afternoon. And it's been a pleasure, and see you the next time, I guess.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It was super fun.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna and Alessandro.
Bye-bye.